Hello, folks. This is Mike, and welcome to this episode of Let's Live Code. Real excited about that. Before we move on and start exploring things like Euclidean rhythms, which is going to be the next video in the series, I wanted to clear the deck on some alternative ways to format code that's going to allow for more flexibility, especially as we keep on going on in this series. Shorter code is going to be easier to look at. And one of the things that I always kind of found confusing when I first learned how to code is that I was always looking for the absolute sort of best way to code, as if I could just like min-max my way to get the code to do exactly what I want it to do. But as I've gotten older and wider and wiser, I've sort of accepted that there's many different ways that can exist within code, and some of these can be better for certain situations than other. But if none of this helps you, just know that if your code is doing what you want it to do, then that is essentially the right way. There's no real wrong way to do this kind of stuff. But let's begin by looking at some order of operation details that may tighten our code up a bit. So let's say we have a basic pattern that looks like this. We have this dry drum that's going 3 times a cycle, and it's being bit crushed at different levels 1, 2, and 3. There, it has kind of a nice glitchy, dry glitch kind of sound to it. We can actually rewrite this by switching the order of operations, right? So we can have the sound file first, and then we can have the effect. Or alternatively, we can also put the effect first, and then the sound file. So with right here, we have D1 $, and then we can, instead of put S, we can put crush, and then we can say we want the crush levels at 1, 2, and 3, and then hashtag our sound file to being the dry bass sound that is going 3 times every cycle. And if we go ahead and evaluate this, we're going to get the exact same thing. Wait a second, let me put the apostrophe in there. We'll get the exact same thing. Okay, and what's interesting about that? Well, interesting being, besides being a totally relative term, is that title always creates patterns of samples in the cycle based on whatever values are being called first from the left-hand side. So in this example, crush is being called first. And since that has 3 values, that means that it'll automatically play 3 different things within that measure. And I actually don't even need to specify that there are 3 dry bass sounds because it's redundant. Title's already playing it. Well, what would happen if you went the opposite direction and put a whole bunch of values in the right-hand side? Well, I am really glad that you asked that question. It's still going to just play those 3 samples. So the big question is then, why would we want to do this? And the reason we would want to do something like this is because it lets you focus your code on the thing that you want to manipulate without having to make sure that you have the sample and the effect patterns line up. Every single time that you add a new effect or a new pattern into Crush, it's going to automatically create those notes for us. See, isn't that exciting? And you thought this might be a dry episode. It's not dry whatsoever. So let's go ahead and let's look at some more shorthand for code. All right, so until now, if I wanted to specify a certain sample in a piece of code, right, I would have to write something like the following. So maybe D1 $, make sure I get my sound file in there, S, Perry, and then I would have to specify with a semicolon that I want the 8th sample. But alternately, if I don't want to, another way I can write this actually is by separating out the sample number from the sound bank. So with Perry being the sound bank, I could write this as S Perry hashtag N and then the number of samples, in which case this is 8. And we get the same thing. And you might be looking at that example thinking, well, the second example is certainly longer than the first example, just by a couple of characters. But what it does is allows us for greater flexibility. So by patterning that out, right? If I put like 12 here, now I can actually specify 12 different samples without having to rewrite the note name for sample every single time that we wanted to call a different note. So just for kicks, that would actually look like something like this. So I think that's a pretty clear example. That seems confusing down in the bottom, where above it, with the index number right there that I'm highlighting, you can really see where if you just manipulate that section of the code, it would be a lot easier. Of course, we can switch these sides, right? Like I don't have to simply just put that on one side. If I switch these sides, then it's already putting 12 values in. All right, so the next up on the docket that I want to talk about is using quotations. You may have noticed in previous videos when I was specifying a single digit that I had no quotations around that number, and that's something that you can do in title. If we're only going to have one object or one thing that we're going to be looking at, we don't have to put that in quotations. You can just call whatever the one value is that you are going to call. If we're going to put a series of things that we want title to recognize, then we do have to put quotations in it in order for it just to recognize that there's a series of objects, right? So if I look at this and I say Perry, and I put 8 of those in a cycle, and I'm going to go ahead and put my sample index at number 4, for example, we're going to get this. Okay, so now that you see that I've patterned out more than one item, you have to use quotations. Look what happens when we do that. Title gets mad at us, and in the middle of its finger wagging, it says it couldn't match expected type integer to pattern controlled map, right? So that is an issue, just to make sure. So obviously, just to show you that if we wanted to play this and we wanted to play it right, all we'd have to do is go back and put this in quotations, and now we'll have different samples. So one of the best ways to get new material out of different patterns really is to apply math to it. And we were doing this before on the left-hand side of something, right? If we wanted something to happen every 3 cycles or whatever, we could do that. But actually, you can apply math or functions anywhere in title. You don't have to just apply them to the left-hand side as we had previously been doing. So let me pull up a pattern to kind of demonstrate a little bit more of what I was doing before. I'll have this pattern of PSR, 8 of them in a cycle, and we'll choose this pattern of 0 and 2. So in this case, we have PSR playing 8 samples in a cycle. The first half of the cycle will play sample indexed at 0, and then it'll move the second half of the measure indexed at 2. But if I put these in parentheses, right, I can apply mathematical transformations of it. So let's go ahead and do the following. Let's go ahead and multiply it by 3. And both of those indexes are getting multiplied by 3. So the first one is 0, and that's why it sounds the same. And the second one is 6, right? You can hear that's clearly the same. Let me go ahead and reset it back to what we had originally. So we can also apply transformations that we learned about earlier to create more variation out of it. So let's say we're looking at the multiplying the index in every 3 measures, and we can simply add the every parameter to the beginning of that, right? So we're going to go ahead and get rid of multiplied by 3, and then in our parentheses, we're going to go ahead and put every before 0 and 2. How many times we're going to do that? We're going to do that 3 times, and then in parentheses, we're going to do what we're doing to 0 and 2, which is multiplying by 3, and we get this. Good, and hopefully you can hear where it changed every 3rd cycle. What's kind of nice about doing this now is it creates a lot of different variation while actually keeping the same rhythm. We can just change the index numbers. Let me demonstrate that for you. So another thing that I think is really helpful knowing, and it's something that I actually forgot to point out to you in a previous video, back when we're talking about audio effects, has to do with the speed parameter. So let me back up a little bit and just demonstrate something that we can look at with speed. I'm going to use $speed, one hashtag, and then I'm going to use a sample that's called Jung Bass, and I'm going to use Jung Bass that's going to be at the third index, right? And we get this really crazy bass sound that sounds a little like this. Now, I said this before, but speed indicates the rate of the playback speed, right? So if we play things back at a faster speed, it's going to go up in pitch. If we play things down at a slower speed, it's going to decrease in pitch. Just to refresh your memory. All right, and let me go ahead and just reset that back to where we are. So besides going faster and going slower, there's a third option that I didn't mention. Since all of our files are really just audio files that we're playing forward, we can easily also play those files backwards as well. So if you didn't want Jung Bass to sound like it was playing forward, we could play it backwards. And the backwards version is going to scoop then from low to high instead of going from high to low. Of course, using this in conjunction with other notes too, we can also just create a pattern of notes, right? And they don't always have to move in the same direction. So in this example, I have -5 to 2.5, and we have this little bass pattern. So another thing that I have not mentioned until now that you may have been wondering about is that we can change the rate at which titles play samples back. We can change the speed of the project, and we do that with a function that's called set CPS, or cycles per second. So right now, we is playing 1 cycle every second. The faster it goes, if I wanted to go twice as fast, I could say 2 cycles per second. If I wanted to go half as fast, it would be 0.5 cycles per second. Woo, I thought I almost broke title right there. All right, so if you want to go slower, then 0.5 would be half. Of course, you might want to translate this over to beats per minute, right? If you come from sort of a musical background instead of a coding background, set CPS might not make the most sense to you. It might make more sense to you to have 60 cycles in a second. If you think about this really quick, if we have 60 cycles in a second, right, that means we're going to have 1 cycle every second. So if I divide 60 by 60, I'm going to get 1. If you look in the post window, obviously that's ones, right? So if I want, something that's going to move twice as fast, then I can put 120 over 60, and that would be 2, right? Well, if you just plug this equation in under set cycles per second, and you put it in parentheses, then you can go ahead and just set that in beats per minute value without having to worry about what that would be translated. All right, and finally, let's go to our last example. This example basically is a longer example that we can kind of code, and I'm going to play a little bit of music with, but it has 4 instruments. One of the first things that I really want you to notice is just look how much room we're saving generally by having this. You can clearly see what all four of these instruments are doing. The first instrument that we have up is a jungle bass, right? And it's playing two notes at different playback speeds. I'm using the greater than less than symbols to alternate between those different sets of notes to get a more musical material out of the playback. It sounds a little something like this. The second instrument is that dry bass, and I'm bit crushing it and passing it through a low-pass filter. Third instrument is a percussion instrument, and I'm using I'm sampling different indexes over the 4 cycles. I'm also running that through a high-pass filter. And the final instrument is really just a long pad that I'm using to kind of fill out the space and create some tension with. So it's a pad long. You can see that I'm dividing it by 40, which means it's not going to repeat until every 40 cycles. I'm also slowing the speed of that down, and I'm going to turn down the volume of this. It takes a little bit for it to creep in. All right, here we go. All right, folks, next up we will be looking at Euclidean rhythms, and I'll be explaining what those are. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Let's Live Code. If you enjoyed this, please hit like and subscribe. I don't know why you would. It's about the driest video ever. But listen, I hope to see you all again next time on Let's Live Code. Bye.